In quiet villages and cozy parlors where teacups clink and roses bloom, Miss Marple watches and notices everything. Behind every smile, she sees the secrets, and where others see gossip, she finds the truth. Welcome to Warm Pages. I'm your host, Hari. Isn't it lovely how these stories bring us together, no matter the distance? Tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? And have you ever guessed the culprit before Miss Marple? Let's begin. Chapter 1. Footprints Among the Roses. Miss Jane Marple was in her garden when the incident occurred. The morning had been particularly fine, with just the right amount of sunshine to coax her prize roses into magnificent bloom. She had risen early, as was her custom, and after a light breakfast of toast and tea, had donned her gardening hat and gloves to attend to her beloved flowers. She was carefully pruning a particularly stubborn branch when she heard the unmistakable sound of her garden gate being flung open with considerable force. Looking up, she saw her neighbor, Mrs. Wilkins, hurrying up the garden path, her usually neat appearance somewhat disheveled, and her expression one of considerable agitation. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Wilkins exclaimed, quite out of breath. "The most extraordinary thing has happened at Thornfield Manor." Miss Marple straightened herself carefully, one hand pressed against the small of her back. At her age, gardening was a pleasure that occasionally exacted its price in discomfort. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilkins," she said calmly. "Do sit down and catch your breath. You look quite overcome." She guided her flustered neighbor to the small wrought-iron bench beneath the apple tree, noting with the sharp eye that had served her so well in matters of village intrigue that Mrs. Wilkins's uniform apron was buttoned incorrectly, suggesting she had dressed in great haste. "It's the rose garden at the manor," Mrs. Wilkins explained once she had regained some composure. "Mr. Jenkins, you know, the head gardener who's been there since before the war, he found footprints all among the roses this morning, and some of the flowers cut, the finest blooms too." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's faded blue eyes showed a flicker of interest. Thornfield Manor, the grand house on the edge of St. Mary Mead, had recently been purchased by a wealthy couple from London, the Hamiltons. They had kept largely to themselves since their arrival, which had naturally been a source of considerable curiosity in the village. "Yes, and that's not all," Mrs. Wilkins continued, lowering her voice conspirationally, though there was no one to overhear them. "The footprints were quite small, like a woman's, and they went right through the rose beds. Mr. Jenkins said whoever it was didn't care a jot about trampling the other plants. Just went straight for those special black roses Mrs. Hamilton had brought in." "Black roses?" Miss Marple questioned, her interest genuinely piqued now. "Do you mean the Midnight Lady variety? They're not truly black, of course, but a very deep crimson that appears almost black in certain lights. Quite rare, I believe." Mrs. Wilkins nodded vigorously. "That's them. Mrs. Hamilton had them specially planted when they moved in. Seems very attached to them, she does. Goes out to look at them most evenings, according to Mr. Jenkins." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She had heard of the variety, of course, but had never seen specimens in person. They were indeed uncommon, particularly in a village garden. "And did Mr. Jenkins report this incident to Mr. Hamilton?" she inquired. "That's just it," Mrs. Wilkins replied, leaning forward. "Mr. Hamilton seemed ever so concerned, much more than you'd expect for a few cut flowers. Called the police straight away, he did. But Mrs. Hamilton, well, she acted like it was nothing at all, said it was probably just local boys playing tricks." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. In her experience, people who dismissed unusual events too readily often had reasons for wanting them ignored. "I work at the manor 3 days a week, as you know," Mrs. Wilkins continued. "Doing the fine cleaning Mrs. Hamilton doesn't trust to the daily help. And I thought, seeing as how you know so much about roses and, well," she hesitated delicately, "about the sort of strange things that sometimes happen in villages, perhaps you might come back with me. Just to look at the garden, you understand. To give an opinion on the damaged roses." Miss Marple considered for a moment. Her interest had certainly been caught, both by the curious incident and by the Hamiltons' contrasting reactions to it. I suppose I could, she agreed, removing her gardening gloves. If you think Mrs. Hamilton wouldn't object to my presence. Oh, she won't mind, Mrs. Wilkins assured her confidently. She's gone into the village for the morning, and Mr. Hamilton is in his study with strict orders not to be disturbed. We can slip into the garden quietly, and Mr. Jenkins would be ever so grateful for your expert opinion. Half an hour later, having changed her gardening attire for a more suitable dress and cardigan, Miss Marple accompanied Mrs. Wilkins along the lane that led to Thornfield Manor. The house was an impressive Victorian structure. Its red brick facade partially covered with ivy, its windows tall and imposing. The gardens, which had once been the pride of the county, had fallen into some neglect under previous owners, but were now being restored to their former glory by Mr. Jenkins and his small team of gardeners. They had barely entered the grounds through the servants' gate when they encountered the elegant figure of Mrs. Hamilton returning unexpectedly early from her errands. She was a tall, slender woman in her 50s, expensively dressed in a manner that spoke of understated wealth. Her dark hair, streaked with grey, was styled in a fashionable cut that framed a face that must once have been strikingly beautiful and was still handsome. Mrs. Wilkins, she said, her voice cool but not unfriendly. I wasn't expecting you until this afternoon. Good morning, Mrs. Hamilton, Mrs. Wilkins replied, flustering slightly at being caught in what might appear to be an imposition. This is Miss Marple from the village. She's quite the expert on roses, and when I mentioned the trouble in the garden, Mrs. Hamilton's gaze turned to Miss Marple, assessing her with intelligent eyes. Ah, yes, Miss Marple. I believe we met briefly at the vicar's tea last month. Indeed we did, Mrs. Hamilton, Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. I hope you don't mind my intrusion. Mrs. Wilkins mentioned your midnight lady roses had been damaged, and I was most concerned. They're such a rare variety. A fleeting expression, something like wariness, crossed Mrs. Hamilton's face before her features composed themselves into a polite smile. It's nothing to be concerned about, she said dismissively. Probably just some village children getting up to mischief. I've told my husband there's no need to make a fuss, but he's already called the police. She sighed, suggesting this was an overreaction. But since you're here, you're welcome to look at the garden. Perhaps you might advise Mr. Jenkins on how best to care for the damaged plants. As Mrs. Hamilton led them through the house, a brief journey that nevertheless afforded Miss Marple a glimpse of elegant, tasteful furnishings that spoke of old money rather than new wealth, she continued with careful casualness. You've lived in St. Mary Mead a long time, haven't you, Miss Marple? All my life, Miss Marple confirmed, apart from brief periods away, of course. Then perhaps you might remember the house before it was called Thornfield Manor. I understand it had a different name some years ago. Before Miss Marple could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of a car crunching on the gravel driveway, followed by the unmistakable authoritative knock of the police at the front door. The garden, when they reached it, was indeed impressive. A series of formal beds surrounding a central fountain, with rose arbors creating shaded walkways between sections. Mr. Jenkins, a weathered white-haired man who must have been well into his 70s, was waiting for them, his lined face creased with concern. At the same moment, a tall, distinguished-looking man emerged from the house, followed by the all-too-familiar figure of Inspector Slack. Mr. Hamilton was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the bearing of a man accustomed to authority, while Inspector Slack wore his usual expression of barely concealed impatience. Miss Marple, the inspector acknowledged with a curt nod that did nothing to hide his annoyance at finding her already at the scene. I might have known you'd be here. Miss Marple is a renowned expert on roses and carried her inside, and later they said it was just the heat, but it was a cool morning in April. Jenkins took another sip of his tea. And something else, Miss Cecilia, their daughter, she's a nice young lady, but she seems afraid of something or someone, always looking over her shoulder, starting at noises. Not natural in a young person. Miss Marple refilled his teacup. You've worked at the manor a very long time, Mr. Jenkins. You must have seen many unusual things over the years. That I have, miss, he agreed with a nod. But nothing quite like this. It's not just the roses and the footprints. There's something not right about the whole situation. Mrs. Hamilton spends hours in that section of the garden, just staring at the ground as if she's looking for something. And Mr. Hamilton, well, he keeps that study of his locked at all times, won't even let the maids in to clean. After Jenkins had departed, promising to keep Miss Marple informed of any further unusual occurrences at the manor, she sat for a long time in thoughtful silence. There was something about the story of the Blackwoods that nagged at her memory, some detail read or overheard years ago. The village library, she decided, would be her next port of call. The librarian, Miss Pratt, was a thin, nervous woman with a surprising wealth of knowledge about local history. When Miss Marple inquired about Edward Blackwood and his rose breeding, Miss Pratt's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Oh yes, Mr. Blackwood was quite famous in horticultural circles, she explained, leading Miss Marple to a dusty shelf of local records. He created several notable varieties, but the Midnight Lady was considered his masterpiece. We have some old newspaper articles about him somewhere. Ah, here we are. She pulled out a large, leather-bound volume of newspaper clippings, carefully preserved by some previous librarian. These are from the 1920s. There should be something about the Blackwoods in here. Together, they leafed through the yellowing pages until Miss Marple spotted a headline. Local woman missing, police investigation underway. The article, dated June 1925, detailed the disappearance of Lillian Blackwood from her home near St. Mary Mead. According to the report, Mrs. Blackwood had last been seen retiring to her bedroom on the evening of June 15th. By morning, she was gone, with no sign of forced entry and no indication of where she might have gone. Her husband, Edward Blackwood, reported that nothing appeared to be missing except the clothes she might have been wearing and a pearl necklace that had been a family heirloom. How very sad, Miss Marple commented as she read. And they never found her. Miss Pratt shook her head. No, it was quite the mystery at the time. Some believed she had run away with a lover, though no one could identify who that might have been. Others suspected Mr. Blackwood, but there was never any evidence against him. Miss Marple studied the grainy photograph that accompanied the article. It showed Blackwood House, unmistakably the building now known as Thornfield Manor, with a police constable standing at the entrance. The caption read, "Police search Blackwood House for clues to missing woman's whereabouts." You know, Miss Pratt added in a confidential tone, my aunt worked as a maid at Blackwood House at that time. She always said there was more to the story than came out publicly. Said that Mrs. Blackwood had been acting strangely in the weeks before her disappearance, secretive, nervous, and she'd been corresponding with someone. Letters that she was very careful to keep hidden from her husband. Did your aunt have any idea who these letters might have been from? She thought it might have been Mrs. Blackwood's sister, Eleanor. They were very close, apparently, but Eleanor had moved away from the village some years earlier after a disagreement with Mr. Blackwood. My aunt said Mrs. Blackwood would only read the letters when she was alone and always destroyed them immediately afterward. Miss Marple thanked Miss Pratt for her assistance and made her way slowly back home, her mind busy with the information she had gathered. The story of the Blackwoods and their connection to Thornfield Manor was intriguing enough, but its possible relevance to the current inhabitants and the mysterious nighttime visitor to the rose garden was what particularly captured her interest. As she approached her cottage, she was surprised to see a slender figure waiting by her garden gate, a young woman who looked nervously up and down the lane as if afraid of being observed. It was Cecilia Hamilton. "Miss Marple," the girl said anxiously as she drew near, "I hope you don't mind my coming to see you like this, but I didn't know who else to talk to. It's about something that happened a long time ago, something I think my parents don't want anyone to know." Chapter 3. A History of Secrets. Miss Marple ushered Cecilia Hamilton into her sitting room, noting the young woman's evident distress. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair and delicate features that held a striking resemblance to the photograph of Lillian Blackwood that Miss Marple had seen in the library archives. "Do sit down, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, gesturing to an armchair. "Would you care for some tea?" "No, Thank you, Cecilia replied, perching nervously on the edge of the seat. Her hands twisted together in her lap, and her eyes darted frequently toward the window, as if expecting to see someone watching. I can't stay long. My parents think I've gone for a walk in the village. Miss Marple nodded understandingly. You mentioned something that happened a long time ago. How can I help you, my dear? Cecilia took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage. I found out recently that I'm adopted, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My parents, the Hamiltons, they've never told me. I discovered the papers by accident when we were moving to Thornfield Manor. I see, Miss Marple said softly. That must have been quite a shock for you. It was, Cecilia agreed, blinking back tears. They were in a box of old documents in Father's study. I was helping with the packing and came across them. They don't know that I know. And this discovery has something to do with your parents' strange behavior since moving here, Miss Marple prompted, gently. Cecilia nodded vigorously. They've been acting oddly ever since we arrived, especially Mother. She spends hours in that rose garden, and sometimes I hear her crying at night. Father locks himself in his study for hours at a time. They argue in whispers when they think I can't hear them. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small, ornate locket. I found this among the adoption papers, she said, opening it to reveal a faded photograph of a young woman wearing a distinctive pearl necklace. She looks like me, doesn't she? I think she might be my real mother. Miss Marple studied the photograph carefully. The resemblance was indeed striking, the same delicate features, the same slightly sad expression around the eyes. And there was no mistaking the pearl necklace, which matched the description in the newspaper article about Lillian Blackwood's disappearance. Where did you find these papers exactly? Miss Marple asked. In Father's study, as I said. There was a false bottom in one of the drawers of his desk. The papers were hidden there, along with this locket and some old letters. Cecilia hesitated. I only read a few of them. They were from someone called Eleanor to someone called Edward. They mentioned someone named Lillian who was in trouble and needed help. The last letter said something about taking the child somewhere safe where he can never find her. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, connecting this new information with what she had already learned. Cecilia, have you ever heard the names Blackwood or Eleanor mentioned in your family? The young woman shook her head. No, never, but there's something else. She lowered her voice further. 2 nights ago, I overheard Mother and Father arguing about the rose garden. Mother said, we have to find it before someone else does. And Father said, after all these years, it might not even be there anymore. What could they be looking for, Miss Marple? I'm not entirely certain, Miss Marple admitted, though her keen mind was already forming theories, but I think it might be connected to the history of Thornfield Manor, or Blackwood House, as it was once. She would pause and look around, as if to ensure she wasn't being observed. As the light began to fade, Mrs. Hamilton finally rose, brushing the soil from her hands and dressed with a gesture of disappointment. She stood for a long moment, staring down at the roses with an expression that, even from a distance, Miss Marple could recognize as one of profound sadness. Then, with a small shake of her head, she turned and walked slowly back toward the house. Miss Marple remained in her hiding place until Mrs. Hamilton had disappeared indoors. Whatever the woman was searching for in the rose garden, she had not found it today. But Miss Marple was now more convinced than ever that the answer to the mystery, both past and present, lay buried somewhere beneath those blood-red blooms. Chapter 4. The Missing Diary Pages. The next morning, Miss Marple set out to visit her old friend Colonel Bantry at his home, Gossington Hall. Though the Colonel's wife had passed away some years before, he maintained the property with military precision and was known to possess an excellent memory for local events of the past. More importantly, his father had been the local magistrate during the time of Lillian Blackwood's disappearance, and might have had access to information not available to the general public. The Colonel greeted her warmly in his book-lined study, immediately offering tea and insisting she take the most comfortable chair by the window. Now then, Jane, he said, using the familiarity of old friendship. "What brings you all the way out to Gossington on such a fine morning?" "Not that I'm not delighted to see you, of course." "I was hoping to pick your brain about an old case," Miss Marple explained. "Or rather, to ask if your father might have left any records pertaining to it. The disappearance of Lillian Blackwood in 1925. Colonel Bantry's bushy eyebrows rose. "Blackwood, eh? That's a name I haven't heard in years." "Yes, father was quite involved in that investigation, as I recall. Puzzling business, never officially solved." "I understand Edward Blackwood was initially suspected but later cleared," Miss Marple prompted. The colonel nodded. "Initially, yes. Classic case. Wife goes missing, husband is the first suspect, but the evidence didn't support it. That witness at the train station was quite definite about seeing Mrs. Blackwood boarding the London train with a man. Not Blackwood himself, as he was accounted for elsewhere at the time." "Your father must have had his own thoughts on the matter," Miss Marple suggested gently. Colonel Bantry smiled. "Sharp as ever, Jane. Yes, father had his theories. He kept a diary, you know, recorded his thoughts on all the interesting cases that came his way. Wait here. I may still have some of his journals in the library." He returned some minutes later, carrying a leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed with age. "Here we are, 1925. Let's see what father had to say about the Blackwood affair." They pored over the diary together, the colonel reading aloud relevant passages, while Miss Marple listened attentively. The magistrate had indeed recorded his impressions of the case in considerable detail. "Most curious," Colonel Bantry read. "Edward Blackwood appears genuinely distressed by his wife's disappearance, yet I cannot shake the feeling that he knows more than he is telling. The evidence of the train porter seems conclusive, and yet something about the whole business disturbs me." He turned several pages. Another entry here, a week later. "Had a visit today from Mrs. Eleanor Wells, sister of the missing woman. A most distressed young lady who seems convinced that her brother-in-law is somehow responsible for Lillian's disappearance. She claims Lillian had confided in her that she feared her husband, who had become obsessively jealous and controlling in recent months. However, she can provide no evidence beyond these alleged confidences." "Did your father believe her?" Miss Marple asked. Colonel Bantry scanned the next few lines. He writes, "I find Miss Wells sincere in her concerns, yet one must consider that sisters often share their marital frustrations without necessarily implying danger. Without corroborating evidence, such statements cannot be given much weight in an official investigation. Sensible assessment, I'd say." As the colonel continued to read, however, his expression changed to one of puzzlement. "That's odd," he muttered, flipping back and forth between pages. "There seems to be a gap here. Pages have been removed." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Removed? Are you certain?" "Quite certain. Look here, you can see where they've been carefully cut out. 3 or 4 pages, I'd say, between this entry on June 30th and this one on July 10th, and the entry on the 10th begins mid-sentence, as if continuing a thought from the missing pages." "What does that entry say?" Miss Marple inquired. Colonel Bantry adjusted his spectacles. "Must remain speculation in the absence of concrete evidence. Blackwood's experiments with plant derivatives are of scientific interest only, and there is no proof of any nefarious application. The matter must rest here unless new information comes to light." "Most peculiar," he commented, closing the diary. "I wonder what father had written on those missing pages." "Could someone have removed them recently?" Miss Marple suggested. The colonel shook his head. "I shouldn't think so. This diary has been in the library cabinet for years, undisturbed. More likely father himself removed the pages. Perhaps they contain speculation too sensitive or defamatory to record permanently. Or perhaps," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "they contained information that someone else didn't want preserved." After thanking Colonel Bantry for his assistance, Miss Marple made her way to the village post office. If Eleanor Wells had been corresponding with someone in London after leaving St. Mary Mead, the postmistress might remember it. Miss Blenkinsop had held that position for over 40 years and took pride in her encyclopedic knowledge of village communications. "Eleanor Wells," Miss Blenkinsop repeated, when Miss Marple made her inquiry. "Oh yes, I remember her well. A quiet young lady, kept to herself mostly. Left the village rather suddenly after that business with her sister." "Did she correspond with anyone after she left?" Miss Marple asked casually, as if merely making conversation. Miss Blenkinsop's eyes lit up with the pleasure of sharing long-stored information. Indeed she did. For years afterward, she would send letters to someone in London. Regular as clockwork they were. Once a month at first, then less frequently as time went on. "Do you recall the address?" Miss Marple asked, though she knew it was unlikely the postmistress would remember such a detail after so many years. "Not the specific address, no," Miss Blenkinsop admitted. "But it was somewhere in Kensington. Rather a good area. The name escapes me now. It wasn't Wells or Blackwood, I remember that much." "And how long did this correspondence continue?" Miss Blenkinsop considered for a moment. "Well into the 1950s, I believe. Then it became more sporadic. The last such letter I recall was sent around 25 years ago. After that, nothing." 25 years ago, Miss Marple noted mentally. Approximately when Cecilia Hamilton would have been born, if her apparent age was any indication. Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who entered the post office with his usual air of brisk efficiency. "Miss Marple," he acknowledged with a nod that was slightly less curt than usual. "Just the person I was hoping to find. I wanted to inform you that the investigation into the garden incident at Thornfield Manor has been officially closed." "Closed?" Miss Marple repeated. "On what grounds, Inspector?" "Mr. Hamilton has insisted that it was nothing more than a prank by local youths," Slack replied, his tone suggesting he was not entirely convinced by this explanation. "He's withdrawn his complaint and requested that the matter be dropped." "I see," Miss Marple said mildly. "Despite your suspicions to the contrary." Inspector Slack's mouth tightened. "I didn't say I had suspicions, Miss Marple. But yes, there were certain aspects of the incident that struck me as unusual. The surgical precision of the rose cuttings, for instance, and the fact that those footprints were made by expensive evening shoes, not the kind of footwear one would expect from village lads out to cause mischief." "Most perceptive of you, Inspector," Miss Marple commented. Slack regarded her with narrowed eyes. "You know something about this business, don't you? Something you haven't shared with the police." "I know no more than you do, Inspector," Miss Marple replied truthfully. "Merely the observations I made at the scene, which you also noted. But it does seem curious that Mr. Hamilton would be so insistent on dropping the matter, doesn't it?" "Curious indeed," Slack agreed. "But without a complaint, my hands are tied. Good day, Miss Marple." That afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected invitation to a garden party at Thornfield Manor. The engraved card, delivered by hand, requested the pleasure of her company at a small reception to introduce the Hamiltons to select members of St. Mary Mead Society. It was an opportunity too useful to decline. The garden party, held the following day, was an elegant affair. Marquees had been erected on the lawn. A string quartet played Mozart from a small pavilion, and uniformed waiters circulated with champagne and canapes. About 30 guests mingled in the summer sunshine, most of them from the upper echelons of local society, with a few who had evidently travelled from London for the occasion. Miss Marple, dressed in her best floral-patterned dress and wearing a modest straw hat, observed the proceedings with keen interest. Mrs. Hamilton moved among her guests with gracious ease, every inch the sophisticated hostess, while Mr. Hamilton engaged in animated conversation with a group of gentlemen near the terrace. Cecilia was also present, looking lovely in a pale blue dress, though Miss Marple noted the strained smile she wore whenever her parents approached. "Miss Marple, how delightful that you could join us," Mrs. Hamilton said, approaching with a champagne flute in hand. "I understand you've been making inquiries about the history of our house." Though her tone was pleasant, there was a subtle edge to her words that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. "Oh, just an old woman's curiosity," Miss Marple replied, with a disarming smile. "I've lived in St. Mary Mead all my life, you see, and remember when this house was called Blackwood House. Such a tragic story associated with it. The poor young woman who disappeared. Mrs. Hamilton's expression remained composed, but Miss Marple observed a slight tightening around her eyes. Yes, we learned about that sad episode when we purchased the property. One hopes that after all this time, the unfortunate lady found happiness wherever she went. Or peace, at least, Miss Marple said, quietly. Before Mrs. Hamilton could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of an elderly lady who approached with the aid of a walking stick. She was expensively dressed, with an imperious manner that suggested she was accustomed to deference. "Victoria, my dear," the newcomer said to Mrs. Hamilton. "What a charming gathering. You must introduce me to your guest." "Of course," Mrs. Hamilton replied, though Miss Marple noticed she had gone rather pale. "Mrs. Carmichael, may I present Miss Marple, a resident of the village. Miss Marple, Mrs. Carmichael is an old family friend from London." "How do you do?" Miss Marple said politely. Mrs. Carmichael surveyed her with sharp eyes. "Charmed, I'm sure. Victoria, when you have a moment, there's something I wish to discuss with you. A matter from the past that I believe requires resolution." The effect of these seemingly innocuous words on Mrs. Hamilton was striking. Her face lost what little color remained, and she cast a desperate glance toward her husband, who was deep in conversation on the far side of the lawn. "Perhaps later, Eleanor," Mrs. Carmichael said, with peculiar emphasis on the name. "We have all the time in the world to catch up." As Mrs. Carmichael moved away to greet other guests, Miss Marple observed the profound distress on Mrs. Hamilton's face. Eleanor, the same name as Lillian Blackwood's sister. It could be coincidence, of course, but Miss Marple did not believe in coincidences. The party continued without further incident, but Miss Marple remained alert to the undercurrents of tension. She noticed how Mr. Hamilton kept a careful eye on Mrs. Carmichael throughout the afternoon, and how Cecilia seemed bewildered by the subtle drama playing out among the adults. As the gathering began to disperse in the early evening, Miss Marple took a brief stroll through the formal gardens. In a secluded area near the rose garden, she discovered a crumpled piece of paper half hidden beneath a lavender bush. Picking it up, she smoothed it out to find a handwritten note. "I know who you are. Meet me at midnight by the roses if you want to keep your secret." There was no signature, but the implication was clear enough. Someone was blackmailing one of the Hamiltons, most likely Mrs. Hamilton, if the meeting place by the roses was any indication. Miss Marple carefully folded the note and slipped it into her handbag. The mystery was deepening, and she suspected that matters would come to a head that very night. Perhaps, she thought, it was time for another evening vigil near the rose garden. Chapter 5. Connections from the Past. As darkness fell over St. Mary Mead that evening, Miss Marple made her preparations with methodical care. She changed into her darkest dress, a navy blue affair normally reserved for winter wear, and found an old black cardigan that would help her blend into the shadows. A pair of comfortable walking shoes completed her attire, sensible footwear being essential for what might prove to be a long vigil. She had given the matter considerable thought during the afternoon. If the note she had found was indeed arranging a midnight meeting in the rose garden, she needed to position herself where she could observe without being seen. The gardener's shed that she had noticed on a previous visit would provide an ideal vantage point, offering both concealment and a clear view of the midnight lady, roses. At 11:30, Miss Marple set out from her cottage, moving quietly through the village lanes. Most houses were already in darkness, their occupants long since retired for the night. The moon was nearly full, providing sufficient light to navigate by once her eyes had adjusted, though she carried a small torch for emergencies. Thornfield Manor loomed against the night sky, most of its windows darkened, save for a faint glow from what Miss Marple presumed to be Mr. Hamilton's study. She approached from the rear of the property, using a small gate in the kitchen garden that Jenkins had mentioned was seldom locked. As she had hoped, it yielded to her gentle push. The gardener's shed stood at the edge of the formal garden, partially concealed by a stand of rhododendrons. Miss Marple made her way to it carefully, avoiding the gravel paths where her footsteps might be heard. The shed door was secured with a simple latch, which she managed to lift without difficulty. Inside, the small structure smelled of earth and fertilizer, with an underlying hint of paraffin from the lamp that hung on a hook by the door. Miss Marple chose not to light it, instead moving to the small window that overlooked the rose garden. A wooden stool beneath the window provided a seat from which she could maintain her watch in relative comfort. The minutes ticked by slowly. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, answered by its mate from the direction of the village. The night air was still and warm, heavy with the scent of roses and summer blooms. Miss Marple remained motionless, her gaze fixed on the dark shapes of the rose bushes silhouetted against the moonlit lawn. At precisely midnight, a figure emerged from the side entrance of the house. Even in the dim light, Miss Marple recognized Mrs. Hamilton by her distinctive posture and the pale gleam of her silver-streaked hair. She was dressed in a dark suit, moving with purpose rather than stealth, as if she had nothing to hide. Mrs. Hamilton went directly to the midnight lady Rose's, where she stood waiting, occasionally glancing back toward the house as if concerned about being observed. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, from the direction of the village, a second figure appeared, moving along the same path Miss Marple herself had taken. It was Mrs. Carmichael, instantly recognizable despite the darkness by her slight stoop and the walking stick she leaned upon. Unlike Mrs. Hamilton, she moved with evident caution, pausing frequently to look around. Apparently not. Look at this final entry. I remain convinced that Lillian Blackwood never left St. Mary Mead alive. Blackwood's obsession with those black roses he bred and named for her strikes me as unwholesome, almost as if they serve as some macabre memorial. If I were to search for the unfortunate woman's remains, I would begin beneath those very blooms. Miss Marple sat very still, absorbing this information. The midnight lady roses, could they indeed have been planted as a marker for Lillian's grave? And if so, was that what Mrs. Hamilton, Eleanor, had been searching for all these years? There's one more thing, Colonel Bantry said, examining the papers more closely. Father made a note here about consulting the land registry regarding ownership of Blackwood House after Edward's death. It seems the property was purchased by a trust, with the true owner's identity concealed behind layers of legal arrangements. Father suspected that Eleanor Wells might have been involved, though he couldn't prove it. As Miss Marple walked home, her mind was busy organizing the facts and connections she had uncovered. If Mrs. Hamilton was indeed Eleanor Wells, she had returned to the scene of her sister's disappearance after all these years, perhaps to find proof of what had really happened, or to finally lay Lillian to rest properly. But what of Mr. Hamilton? Who was he in this decades-old drama? And Cecilia, the young woman who had discovered she was adopted and who bore such a striking resemblance to Lillian Blackwood. The locket, the pearl necklace, the cryptic reference in Eleanor's letters to taking the child somewhere safe. The pieces were beginning to form a coherent pattern, but Miss Marple needed one more element to complete the picture. She needed proof, and she suspected that proof lay buried beneath the midnight lady roses in the garden of Thornfield Manor. Chapter 6. Justice Blooms at Dawn. The following morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect summer light that seemed to mock the dark secrets Miss Marple had uncovered. She had slept little, her mind preoccupied with arranging the facts of the case into a coherent narrative. By dawn, she had resolved upon a course of action. First, she telephoned Inspector Slack at the police station, requesting his presence at Thornfield Manor at 9 o'clock. Though clearly surprised by her call, something in her tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the matter, for he agreed without his usual objections. Next, she wrote a brief note to Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton, which she had delivered by the village boy who often ran errands for her. The note simply requested that they meet her in the rose garden at the appointed hour, as she had information of grave importance to share concerning both their past and their present situation. Finally, she sent word to Mr. Jenkins, asking if he would be good enough to join them as well. The old gardener, she suspected, might have knowledge he himself did not fully recognize the significance of. At 8:45, Miss Marple made her way to Thornfield Manor for what she believed would be the final act in a drama that had begun nearly 70 years before. She found Mr. Jenkins already waiting near the rose garden, his weathered face creased with concern. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," she greeted him. "Thank you for coming." "Morning, miss," he replied, tugging nervously at his cap. "Your message said it was important." "Indeed it is," Miss Marple confirmed. "I believe we are about to uncover the truth about what happened to Lillian Blackwood all those years ago." The gardener's eyes widened. "Here? Now?" "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "And I believe you may have information that will help us. Information you may not even realize you possess." Before Jenkins could respond, they were joined by Inspector Slack, who arrived with a younger constable in tow. The inspector looked skeptical but alert, his notebook already in hand. "Miss Marple," he acknowledged with a nod. "I hope this isn't a wild goose chase. We have a suspicious death to investigate, that London lady who was staying at the inn." "Mrs. Carmichael's death is not unrelated to what I have to tell you, Inspector," Miss Marple assured him. "In fact, I believe her death may mirror another that occurred decades ago." At that moment, the Hamiltons appeared. Approaching from the direction of the house, Mr. Hamilton looked stern and composed, but Mrs. Hamilton seemed pale and anxious. Behind them came Cecilia, her expression one of confusion and distress. "Miss Marple," Mr. Hamilton began formally, "your note suggested some urgency. What is this about?" Miss Marple surveyed the assembled group, noting how they arranged themselves, Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton standing close together, Cecilia slightly apart, Inspector Slack watching with professional detachment, and old Jenkins hovering uncertainly at the edge of the gathering. "I've asked you all here," Miss Marple began, "because I believe I have solved two mysteries, one from the distant past and one from just 2 nights ago. They are connected, joined by threads that stretch across nearly 7 decades. She turned to Mrs. Hamilton. "You are not Victoria Hamilton, are you? You are Eleanor Wells, sister of Lillian Blackwood, who disappeared from this very house in June of 1925. There was a sharp intake of breath from Cecilia, but Mrs. Hamilton merely closed her eyes briefly, as if in resignation. "And you, Mr. Hamilton," Miss Marple continued, "are not Robert Hamilton, but Robert Wells, Eleanor's husband, who has supported her through all these years of searching for the truth about her sister's fate." "This is preposterous," Mr. Hamilton protested, but his denial lacked conviction. "Is it?" Miss Marple challenged gently. "Or is it the truth that you and Eleanor have concealed for so long? The truth that Mrs. Carmichael discovered, and for which she may have paid with her life?" Inspector Slack stepped forward. "These are serious insinuations, Miss Marple. Do you have evidence to support them?" "I believe I do," Miss Marple replied, "beginning with the fact that Mrs. Hamilton was recognized by Mrs. Carmichael at the garden party and addressed as Eleanor, a fact I witnessed myself. Then there was the midnight meeting here in this garden, where Mrs. Carmichael directly accused Mrs. Hamilton of being Eleanor Wells and demanded to know what had happened to Lillian." Mrs. Hamilton's composure finally broke. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am Eleanor, but we had nothing to do with Agnes Carmichael's death. Nothing." "Perhaps not directly," Miss Marple conceded, "but your husband threatened her, did he not? And the manner of her death, an apparent heart attack with certain peculiar symptoms, bears a striking resemblance to the effects of plant-derived poisons that Edward Blackwood was known to have experimented with." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Inspector Slack demanded. "I'm suggesting, Inspector, that Lillian Blackwood never left St. Mary Mead alive in 1925, that the witness who claimed to have seen her boarding a train was either mistaken or bribed to provide Edward Blackwood with an alibi, and that Lillian's body has been here all along, buried beneath the midnight lady roses that her husband bred and named for her, roses that Hamilton, or Eleanor, specifically had planted in this exact location when she returned to the house." A stunned silence followed this statement, broken only when Cecilia stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "Is that true?" she asked her mother. "Is that why you've been searching in the garden at night, looking for Aunt Lillian's grave?" Eleanor Wells looked at her daughter with a mixture of love and sorrow. Yes, she admitted. I've been trying to find proof of what I've suspected all these years, that Edward murdered Lillian when he discovered she was pregnant with another man's child. She turned to Miss Marple. But how did you know about the pregnancy? That was our family's most carefully guarded secret. It was recorded in the private diary of Colonel Bantry's father, who was the magistrate at the time, Miss Marple explained. He had spoken with Dr. Simmons, who had examined Lillian shortly before her disappearance. The doctor had confirmed that she was with child, a child that could not possibly have been Edward Blackwood's, as he was sterile due to a childhood illness. Miss Marple turned to Cecilia, whose